Hello, guys. Tonight we slip into the earthy, smoke-filled world of medieval village life. A place where the smell of wood smoke hangs in the rafters and the floor beneath your feet is nothing but packed mud, swept only when someone remembers, and never quite free of chicken feathers. You stand in a one-room hut, dim candlelight dancing over crooked beams, the air carrying both the scent of the evening stew and something a little more human. The straw bed in the corner is lumpy and shared. A nest of blankets, wool, and whatever hay hasn't been stolen by the goat. You probably won't survive this if you're looking for anything like modern privacy or romance. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the packed earth floor, feeling its uneven ridges under your bare feet. In the corner, the straw mattress has settled into the shape of its occupants over years of use. There's no memory foam here, just an itchy reminder of the fields it came from. If you're lucky, it's raised slightly above the floor to keep the damp from seeping into your bones. If you're unlucky, you share it with the family chicken until she finds a warmer spot. This was the romantic backdrop for most peasant couples' love stories unfolding on bedding that doubled as a stage for fleas, lice, and the occasional mouse sprinting through the night. And yet, this was normal. In fact, historians still argue whether peasants even thought of the bed as a purely private space or simply an extension of the day's chores. Your intimacy is not something to be hidden in the architectural sense because there's nowhere to hide it. That same mattress is where you give birth, nurse your child, recover from sickness, and yes, try to enjoy a little closeness with your partner. Privacy, in this world, is less about space and more about timing. By the faint light of the hearth, you might imagine trying to create some atmosphere, but atmosphere in a medieval hut comes with smoke curling into your eyes because the chimney is just a hole in the roof. The warmth is pleasant, though especially in winter, so you put up with the sting and the cough. This was romance, as dictated by survival. The floor isn't swept to impress anyone. It's kept clear so you don't trip over a stool on your way to the bed. You might even have to nudge the family dog or sheep out of the way before you crawl under the woolen blankets. The mainstream historical fact is this. Most medieval peasants lived in single-room homes where all domestic life happened in one shared space. Archaeological digs of peasant cottages reveal that sleeping quarters were often just one part of a multi-use room, with animals sometimes quartered under the same roof for warmth. That means the soundtrack of your love life might include the bleat of a goat or the clink of a cow's tether chain. Now here's the quirky part. Some couples actually found this comforting. The familiar noises, the closeness of both humans and animals, the steady rhythm of breathing in the dark, all created a sense of shared life that was as romantic as a candlelit dinner in their own cultural context. If you squint hard enough, you could say a medieval peasant's idea of intimacy was a community affair, though hopefully without the literal involvement of the neighbors. Still, there were little tricks to make the space feel more private. You might hang a rough linen curtain from a beam to create a small sleeping alcove. You might scatter aromatic herbs in the straw to keep away pests and add a pleasant scent. Imagine tucking sprigs of lavender into the bedding, not for Instagram aesthetics, but because otherwise the smell of the bedding might drive you away before your partner could get anywhere near romantic conversation. And remember, there's no evening stroll to the cinema, no dinner at a candlelit restaurant. The entire courtship, marriage, and family life revolve around the same square few meters. That means your bedroom talk happens next to a cauldron of stew and under the gaze of saints' icons hanging crookedly on the wall. It's humble, yes, but also deeply practical. Historians still argue whether peasants actually considered intimacy as separate from the rest of their domestic life, or if it was simply another necessary act, like kneading bread or patching clothes. There's something almost grounding about the idea, no elaborate setup, no endless checklist, just the willingness to find connection wherever you could, even if wherever meant on a scratchy bed with the sound of pigs shifting in their pen. The packed earth floor beneath your feet holds the day's history. muddy footprints from the field, spilled broth from dinner, little impressions where someone's knees knelt to mend a shoe. And now, under the fading firelight, it's the setting for something softer, quieter, more human. You shift the blankets, settle onto the straw, and accept that romance here isn't about setting the scene, it's about finding it, no matter how much dirt is on the floor. You wake to the smell of hay and the low shuffle of animals outside, the roosters having long since decided that dawn was whenever they felt like it. You step out into the chill, pulling your rough wool cloak around your shoulders, and the first thing you notice is the barn, your village's social hub for the young and the hopeful. Courtship here is nothing like the painted serenades of nobles. Instead, it's bound to the rhythms of work, and work is everywhere. You've been watching the way a certain someone carries the water buckets, the easy swing in their step, the way they toss their hair back when it gets in their eyes. In a medieval peasant's world, flirting happens between tasks. You lift a sack of grain together, you share a drink from the same ladle, and maybe if the moment feels right, you linger a second longer than needed when passing it back. The barn isn't just a shelter for oxen, it's a stage for subtle exchanges. The mainstream historical fact here is that rural courtship often revolved around shared labor. Harvesting, threshing, milking, these were opportunities for young men and women to be in each other's company, without breaking the strict boundaries of community oversight. Many villages treated work gatherings as safe spaces where courtship could bloom without raising suspicion. It sounds wholesome enough, but the undercurrent of possibility was always there. And here's the quirky bit. Some communities had playful work games, designed specifically to allow a bit of touching under the guise of labor. Imagine a hay bundling contest where pairs had to tie and stack together, ending up laughing, tangled in stalks, and brushing against each other, by accident. It wasn't just fun, it was a sanctioned loophole in the social code. You lean your pitchfork against the wall and watch as a couple near the feed trough seems to take forever adjusting a rope on the ox's harness. The older women mutter that they're wasting time. The younger ones pretend not to notice, though they glance often. You can feel the barn as a living organism, its timbers absorbing the rustle of straw and the soft conspiratorial laughter of its occupants. Historians still argue whether such spaces were intentionally left unsupervised to encourage marriages, or if the lack of oversight was simply a byproduct of necessity after all. Someone had to work the fields while others handled the animals. Either way, barns became neutral zones where social rules bent just enough to allow for possibility. If you're looking for privacy, you might slip into the hayloft under the pretense of fetching more straw. The ladder creaks. Your boots stir up dust motes that glitter in the shafts of sunlight, and you emerge into a space smelling sweetly of dried grass. From here you can look down on the whole barn, invisible unless someone cranes their neck. It's not exactly soundproof, but it's removed enough to feel daring. There's a particular romance in the barn's sensory palette, the warmth radiating from the cows, the muffled stamping of hooves, the faint trickle of water in the trough, and the rich, earthy scent that clings to your clothes after. To a modern nose it might not seem ideal, but to a medieval peasant it's comfort, abundance, and life itself. Sharing that space with someone you fancy is almost an unspoken vow. I am part of your work, your days, your future. You shift a pile of straw and find an old wooden comb someone must have left behind, a small, intimate object in such a public place. You imagine its owner fixing their hair before stepping out to meet their sweetheart. These little tokens are scattered throughout the barn like breadcrumbs in a story, hinting at the private narratives woven through the day's labor. And perhaps tonight, when the animals are fed and the tools are stored, someone will suggest checking the harnesses just one more time. You'll follow, pretending you don't know exactly what they mean, and the barn will settle around you like a conspirator, holding its breath until you leave. You sit up on the edge of the bed you share with most of your household and stretch, your breath clouding faintly in the cool morning air. Across the room, your younger siblings are still curled together like a pile of kittens, and the hearth has gone to embers. Outside, the mist hangs low, and through it you can hear the distant toll of the church bell. Another reminder that life here moves to rhythms far older than you. Today is market day, but before you get anywhere near the stalls, you're going to witness a little tradition that's equal parts awkward and strangely charming. The one-room home isn't just where you sleep and eat, it's also the stage for one of the more public parts of private life. The bedding ceremony. Imagine this happens when a couple is newly married, and the entire community decides it's their business to see the first night off properly. Neighbors and relatives crowd in, cracking jokes, singing songs, sometimes even guiding the newlyweds toward the bed with a mix of teasing and blessings. It's not about voyeurism in the salacious sense, it's more about the village claiming a stake in the union, ensuring it's off to a good start. Contemporary records from rural parishes show that this practice wasn't limited to the nobility. In many peasant villages across Europe, the putting to bed was a semi-ritual act that blurred the line between a marriage celebration and a community inspection. The idea was to reinforce bonds, ensure legitimacy, and let's be honest, give everyone a bit of entertainment in a life that offered very little of it. In one account from a 14th century French village, friends of the groom carried him into the bedroom on their shoulders while others tossed handfuls of grain across the bed for fertility. In another, from a rural English manor's records, the bride's veil was snatched off at the doorway, supposedly to let the blessings in, but clearly doubling as a moment for raucous laughter. There's still disagreement among social historians as to whether these ceremonies were truly joyful for the couple or quietly dreaded. On the one hand, it meant a wedding gift of sorts from the entire village: food, song, and a show of support. On the other, it meant very little privacy on a night you might have hoped would be your own. You can imagine the flushed faces, the forced smiles, the nervous glances toward the door as yet another aunt or cousin steps inside to wish you well. The sensory details are vivid. You smell the candle wax dripping onto the floorboards, hear the fiddle music faintly from outside, and feel the press of bodies in a small room thick with wood smoke and laughter. A neighbor hands you a mug of ale to keep warm, but you can't tell if it's for comfort or courage. The straw mattress creaks when you sit on it, and someone shouts from the doorway, "Make sure it doesn't creak too much," sending the crowd into roars of laughter. There's a peculiar intimacy to it, not between the couple, but between the couple and the entire village. It's a reminder that in the medieval world, marriage wasn't simply about love, it was about community alliances, property ties, and shared survival. The private was always to some extent public. When at last the door closes and the last straggler stumbles away, you can still hear the muffled singing fading into the night. The hearth glows faintly, the blankets are warm from the press of bodies, and you're left in that curious medieval blend of romance and ritual, where your first night together comes preloaded with both blessing and burden. The air outside is sharp with the scent of wet earth, and you follow the winding path toward the churchyard. The wooden doors are still shut, but you're not here for Sunday Mass. You're here for something a little older, a little more unusual, a custom that unfolds right at the threshold. In certain corners of medieval Europe, promises of love and fidelity weren't always sealed inside the church before the altar. Sometimes they were spoken outside, literally on the church's doorstep, as though the building itself was listening. Village customs at the time reveal that this was more than a quaint quirk. For many peasants, entering the church for a marriage meant fees, official witnesses, and the formality of the priest's record book. Standing at the doorway, however, allowed couples to make vows in view of the community without incurring the full weight or cost of a sanctioned wedding. Some called it troth plighting, others simply saw it as the first step toward eventual church recognition. You can picture it now. The wooden planks beneath your feet are worn smooth by decades of villagers passing in and out. The air smells faintly of candle smoke leaking from the cracks, and your breath mingles in the cold with the person you're about to pledge yourself to. Behind you, a few neighbors pretend they're on their way to draw water, but they linger just long enough to hear the words. In one account from a 15th century English parish register, a couple exchanged vows in this way while holding hands over the church's threshold stone. The record notes that it was as binding as the altar, so long as witnesses could attest to it. In other cases, The local priest might stand inside the doorway, peering out, offering a blessing without ever stepping into the open air, half in, half out, as though to preserve the church's dignity. Some researchers remain divided on whether these doorstep vows were a legal loophole or simply a cultural preference. For poorer villagers, it may have been the only affordable option. For others, it might have carried a romantic symbolism, the doorway representing the transition from one stage of life to another. There's a certain poetry to it. The heavy wooden doors frame you both, the carved saints looking down with patient expressions. Your hands are rough from work, but they're steady as you speak the words you've decided on. Words that feel both old and entirely your own. A gust of wind rattles the latch, almost as if the church itself is giving its approval or warning. And afterward, there's no fanfare, no feasting tables, no hired musicians. You might share a hunk of bread on the walk back to your cottage, or stop to greet friends who ask if it's official now. In your heart it is. The church steps are behind you, but the weight of the moment clings like the faint scent of incense in your clothes, a quiet reminder that sometimes love in the medieval countryside needed no more than a threshold to stand upon. The year turns in a slow circle here. The sky shifts its hue, the fields change their scent, and with each season comes a different tempo of village life. Love, like everything else, bends to these rhythms. You might think desire is a constant, but in the medieval countryside it often swelled or quieted depending on the calendar. The very pattern of planting and harvesting shaped when and how couples found time for closeness. In the long months of spring, the air is restless. The thaw releases the smell of wet soil, and the planting season demands every able body. Hands are busy, backs bent, yet the days grow longer and warmer, making twilight walks or stolen moments behind a hedgerow possible. For some, spring was the soft beginning of courtship, when the future felt as open as the furrowed fields. But come late summer, the urgency changes. The harvest looms like a king who demands everything from his people. It's well documented that during the harvest, even married couples saw each other less in private. Everyone rose before sunrise, working until the moon climbed over the fields, meals eaten in haste under the open sky. Exhaustion wasn't just physical, it seeped into the small rituals of affection. You might exchange nothing more than a nod across a field, your hands too blistered for anything gentle. Still, there was a strange intimacy in the shared labor, a kind of wordless bond, reinforced with each sheaf tied and each basket carried. Winter, however, winter was a different story. The days were short, the fields lay dormant, and the hearth became the center of life. Couples found themselves indoors far more often, pressed together against the cold, their breath mingling in the shadows. The lack of agricultural urgency meant time for talking, for laughter, for warmth that wasn't just about firewood. In some villages, winter was even regarded as the season of conception, its timing ensuring births would happen after the following harvest, when food was more plentiful. Not every scholar agrees on how deliberate this timing was. Some argue that the patterns of birth records are more coincidence than strategy, pointing to the unpredictability of medieval life. Disease, famine, and the occasional war could scatter even the best-laid plans. Others believe couples and communities were far more calculating, consciously aligning intimacy with survival needs, even if they didn't put it into writing. One 14th-century farming diary from Flanders notes that, in summer, the bed is for rest, in winter, for love. The line is followed by an entry on sheep shearing, suggesting that the writer didn't see a separation between work and affection. They were all part of the same cycle. Imagine the comfort of that rhythm, the way it wove into your bones, the busy urgency of planting, the long silence of winter evenings, the soft in-between days of autumn, when the year seemed to sigh before starting over. The sensory contrast between seasons was stark. Summer's love smelled of sweat and fresh-cut grass, the air alive with crickets. Winter's love was wrapped in the smell of wood smoke and wool, with only the creak of the cottage beams to break the hush. In spring, you might find yourself laughing with your partner, while mending tools in the yard, the sunlight spilling over the garden plot. In autumn, you'd trade those bright hours for the slow satisfaction of sharing a jug of ale by firelight, knowing the fields were finished for the year. Market gossip often reflected these patterns too. In spring, you'd hear the whispers of who had been walking together after vespers. In autumn, the talk might shift to who was expecting a child in the coming spring, a casual calendar kept in the minds of every watchful neighbor. Marriage arrangements, likewise, were sometimes planned to align with these seasonal tides. A wedding in late winter allowed the couple to settle in before the hardest field labor began. A wedding in early autumn came with the promise of enough stored grain to start a household. There's a kind of romance in the inevitability of it. You couldn't fight the seasons, so you learned to live inside them. Modern life might let you turn on a light at any hour, work when you choose, and find privacy in abundance. But in the medieval village, love was always in conversation with the land itself. The rain, the frost, the swelling of the grain, they all had a say in when you reached for another's hand. And so you find yourself on a late winter night, the wind pushing against the shutters, the fire painting the walls in flickering amber. There's nowhere to be tomorrow, except where you already are. No field calling for you before dawn. The year will quicken soon enough, but for now, you can let the slow heartbeat of winter set the pace. In this season, desire doesn't hurry, it settles in, uncoiling like a cat by the hearth, content to linger. The barn smells different after dusk. The air turns cooler, the dust settles into the shadows, and the last golden streaks of sunlight fade from between the gaps in the timber. You know the work is done because the animals have gone quiet, save for the occasional slow shuffle of hooves or a contented sigh from the cow stalls. And yet for some, the real purpose of climbing that ladder into the hayloft is only beginning. Across medieval villages, haylofts served more than their obvious function of storing winter feed. They were high, secluded, and muffled by the scent and texture of hay places where you could be out of sight without being far from the center of life. Written accounts from rural communities mention stolen conversations and whispered courtships that bloomed in the dim half-light above the barn floor. The loft was a liminal space, private enough to feel daring, public enough to avoid suspicion if someone happened to pass through. The hay up here is dry and sweet-smelling, prickling against your skin but soft enough to sink into. You can see the moon through the gaps in the roof slats, its pale light falling in fractured lines across the floorboards. From this vantage point, you watch the yard below someone closing the henhouse, a dog nosing at an empty bucket while your companion leans close, their voice low so it won't carry. Some researchers point out that haylofts offered more than romantic seclusion. They were also safe spaces for exchanging secrets, making plans, or sharing gossip. In communities where nearly every word you spoke could travel by morning, the loft gave you a rare pocket of control over your own story. Whether you whispered about love or about a neighbor's scandal, the hay muffled the sound as surely as it muffled the footsteps of the mice darting between the bales. Not every loft story ended in affection. Folklore from certain regions paints them as places of mischief or youthful rebellion, where daring boys might boast of sneaking into the loft only to have the ladder pulled up after them by giggling girls. In some tales, a stern elder would climb up unannounced, scattering the quiet like startled pigeons. These stories served as warnings and entertainment in equal measure, retold with knowing smiles by the hearth. One 15th-century German village chronicle describes an incident where a hayloft meeting led to a public reckoning in the square. The couple had been found lying back on a heap of clover hay, boots off, cheeks flushed, not indecent by modern standards, but suggestive enough for the watchful eyes of their neighbors. The punishment? They were ordered to clean the entire barnyard together, a sentence that probably pleased the gossips more than it shamed the pair. There's something about the sensory world of the loft that lingers in the mind. The tickle of straw in your hair, the faint warmth of hay that's been holding sunlight all day, the gentle rustle as you shift and settle in. You hear the soft breathing of the animals below, steady as a heartbeat, and the occasional creak of the wooden beams adjusting to the cooling night air. The loft becomes a cocoon, wrapping you in its golden walls, making the outside world feel distant and unimportant. In that quiet, you're aware of how small the village is, how little space there is to truly be alone. Yet here, suspended between the floor and the roof, you can imagine you've carved out a corner of your own. A place where laughter is safe, where words can be spoken without ricochet, where time itself feels slower. And when you finally climb down, the ladder swaying gently under your weight, the night air feels cooler, sharper. The yard is almost empty now, the last of the lanterns guttering out. You brush stray bits of hay from your clothes, careful to leave no trace that might catch an elder's eye, and walk home with the faint scent of clover following you like a secret you don't intend to share. Morning comes with a ringing you can hear even through the mist, the deep, deliberate toll of the church bell. It's not Sunday service. This is the sound that draws villagers toward the great wooden doors for another kind of gathering, the making of vows in front of those who will hold you to them. The practice is older than many of the cottages you pass along the way, and it unfolds in a manner that's both solemn and oddly informal. The church doorway stands open, but the couple does not step inside. Instead, they meet just outside the threshold, where the carved lintel casts a shadow across the worn flagstones. The spot feels charged, as though the air itself is holding its breath. In a time when formal marriages often required costly documentation or the oversight of high-ranking clergy, some couples took to sealing their promises here within sight of the altar, yet not quite on it. Parish records from parts of England and northern France show that these doorstep unions carried real weight. A pair could clasp hands over the threshold stone, speak their vows clearly in the hearing of witnesses, and walk away considered bound in the eyes of their neighbours. The logic was simple. Everyone saw it, everyone heard it, so everyone could vouch for it. In a world where memory served as legal proof, that was enough. The sensory details are vivid even centuries later. The air smells of old oak and damp stone, the morning light filtering through stained glass to spill faint colours on the ground. A neighbour stands nearby with a basket of onions, pretending she's only passing through, but her gaze is fixed on the couple's clasped hands. Somewhere a child giggles before being hushed. The priest might be just inside, his robes brushing the doorway as he leans forward to murmur a blessing without ever stepping into the sunlight. There's disagreement among scholars about the meaning of this half-in, half-out ritual. Some see it as a clever dodge to avoid certain church taxes or legal entanglements. Others argue it was steeped in symbolism, the doorway as the meeting place between the sacred and the secular, a threshold to a shared life. Perhaps, as with so many rural customs, it was both practical and poetic all at once. In one remembered tale, a bride wore no veil but carried a sprig of rosemary, and the groom brought her a loaf of fresh bread. After their vows, they broke the bread together, each taking a piece before offering some to the small crowd. The act was simple, unadorned, but it bound them to each other and to the village's shared table. When the words are spoken, the witnesses nod and murmur approval. The couple steps back from the shadow into the full light of the square, where the day's ordinary bustle begins again, bargaining over turnips, the clatter of a cartwheel on the cobbles, the smell of baking bread drifting from a nearby hearth. Life continues, but the couple walks home with a different weight in their step, the threshold behind them and a shared path ahead. Steam curls from the bathhouse roof like a lazy dragon, and you follow it the way a cat follows a sunbeam. The door creaks, a warm, damp sigh escaping into the chill lane, and the smell hits you first. Resinous wood, wet stone, a hint of rosemary from someone's sachet, and that mineral tang of heated water. You step inside and the world softens. Voices drop, laughter turns rounder at the edges, and the clack of wooden clogs on the floor sounds like rain on a dock. Compared to the smoky cottage and the hayloft's dust, this is a different planet, slick, bright, and pleasantly drowsy. You set your bundle on a bench and look around. The attendants move like practice dancers, refilling buckets, stoking the furnace, passing out little wooden ladles for pouring hot water over shoulders. The tubs are not private so much as personal. You slip into one and feel your bones. Remember that they have been cold for months. The surface shivers when you breathe. Someone to your left hums a scrap of a song you recognize from last midsummer, and you realize the bathhouse is as much a memory vault as a place to get clean. City and market town records make it clear that public baths were a fixture across late medieval Europe, especially in German lands, France, and parts of Italy. Guild ordinances regulate opening hours, wood supply, and even the quality of towels, as if cleanliness itself needed a union rep. In one set of rules from Augsburg, bathhouse keepers must post a bucket of cool water for faintness and keep the benches scrubbed, a reminder that comfort and order mattered even where people let their shoulders drop. If you're imagining a free-for-all, think again. The bathhouse is managed like a mill, but scented. Of course, regulation rarely stops rumor. The bathhouse is the warmest gossip mill in town. You hear who argued with the reeve over fence lines, who dropped a jug at the well, who stared a heartbeat too long at the baker's apprentice. Reputation floats here like steam. It condenses on the rafters and drips into conversations. You pretend not to listen. Everyone pretends not to listen. Meanwhile, the attendant brings a tray with mugs of watered wine, because apparently your paws need company. Quirky detail for your mental shelf. Some places served snacks and drinks in the tubs, a kind of medieval spa tavern. Picture yourself nibbling a piece of honey cake while soaking, trying not to let crumbs escape into the water like tiny ships of shame. In a few illustrations, bathers wear conical felt bath hats to keep their heads cool, a look that says relaxed wizard more than health regimen. It is practical, and also a little fabulous. You glide your hand through the water and feel the heat return feeling to your fingers. Across the room, a couple shares a low-voiced joke, their laughter dissolving into the steam. That is the quiet truth of this place. The bathhouse is a social cushion, a pocket of amnesty where conversation loosens and glances grow friendly. Affection here is public, but softened. People sit shoulder to shoulder, passing the ladle, offering a towel, complimenting each other's rosemary sachets with a sincerity that might be flirtation or might just be gratitude. Scholars are still split on how mixed these spaces typically were. Some periods and regions likely hosted co-ed bathing at certain hours, while others enforced alternation by sex or strict separation behind screens. Church councils and moralists issued periodic warnings about indecencies in baths, which tells you less about what always happened and more about what worried them. The truth seems locally flavored. What is improper in one town might be ordinary in the next, the rules fogging and clearing with the steam. Meanwhile, you discover a secret bathhouse law. No one moves fast. The heat slows you down, turns your thoughts to syrup, and even the snarkiest neighbor becomes a mellow reed in the warm current. That does not mean the place is innocent. The bathhouse keeper takes care to usher out rowdy youths and to keep a watchful eye on alcoves where shadows gather too eagerly. Municipal fines exist for disorderly conduct among bathers, which is bureaucratic code for you know exactly what. Let's keep it PG and say the staff know how to tap a bucket against the floor in a way that resets the room's mood. You lean your head back against the rim and watch the ceiling beams darken with moisture. Somewhere behind the furnace wall, a log shifts with a hollow thump. There's a pleasant vanity to the bath as well. The little wooden combs, the packets of herbs tied up in cloth, the way people emerge glowing, as if the world has been sanded smoother. If you came here after a long day threshing, you leave feeling as if you could be painted into a manuscript margin with tiny gold leaf around your cheeks. Not everyone approves. A friar on the square has been known to sermonize about the perils of warm water and warmer company. And after waves of plague, some towns curtailed bathing, or at least the sociable kind. The rationale shifts. Sometimes hygiene is praised, sometimes feared, but the bathhouse persists like a stubborn spring. When restrictions arrive, the village mutters and adapts, shifting to private tubs in back rooms or to riverside washing when the weather permits. The steam belongs to people, and people are inventive. You strike up a conversation with the woman in the next tub. She tells you how her cousin met her husband here after he offered her the better ladle and a seat closer to the furnace, which might be the most practical romance you've heard all year. You both snort softly at that, causing a tiny tidal wave that laps the rim. Light joke number 1. You note that nothing says I care about you like upgrading someone's ladle. Light joke number 2 arrives when an attendant scolds a boy for cannonballing into a tub, which is apparently not a sanctioned medieval swim move. Light joke number 3 is your internal vow to invent a line of luxury bath hats and become, as the minstrels say, absurdly well-to-do. Under all the humour lies a tender truth. The bathhouse gives peasant life something it rarely offers: sanctioned pause. The door shuts out chores. The heat unwinds the day, and you are allowed, if only for an hour, to be a body floating in comfort rather than a pair of hands pulling, lifting, mending, hauling. That change in posture invites a change in feeling. Conversations tilt toward confidences. Eyes soften. A shoulder leaning lightly on another's becomes both a thank you and a maybe. Early modern moralists later tried to paint bathhouses as dens of vice, and there were certainly places where sex work attached itself to the business like ivy. But the picture is broader and warmer. Many bathhouses were family enterprises, their ledgers full of wood deliveries and towel laundering, their rooms busy with elders, children, and labourers seeking heat and quiet. If temptation rises with the steam, so too does kindness. The truth you carry out with your towel is complicated and humane. When you finally climb from the water, your skin feels new, your hair smells faintly of herbs, and the evening air outside has the texture of silk. You step into the lane with slow feet, the world a little fuzzed at the edges in the nicest way. The bathhouse door closes behind you with the soft thunk of a satisfied book. Tomorrow's chores will return with their sharp elbows, but tonight your body remembers softness, and so does your heart. You tuck that memory away like a warm pebble, small enough to carry, heavy enough to matter. The village green looks almost ordinary by day, patches of grass worn thin by passing feet, a few benches weathered into silver grey, chickens pecking in the dust. But tonight, it's transformed. Torches flicker around a tall wooden pole wrapped in fresh greenery and bright ribbons. Drums thump in an unhurried heartbeat, and the air smells of wood smoke, crushed grass, and something sweet baking in a nearby oven. The maypole dance is about to begin, and with it, a night that toes the line between tradition and temptation. May festivals in medieval Europe were a curious blend of sacred and unruly. Chroniclers note that they often coincided with religious feast days, yet the tone leaned more toward revelry than piety. The pole itself, stripped of bark and dressed in ribbons, became a magnet for music, laughter, and rituals steeped in fertility symbolism. Some towns even placed it near the church, as if daring the sacred to look the other way. Others set it in a meadow or green space beyond the walls, giving the celebration a freer edge. A 15th century account from the Low Countries describes the maypole dance as a weaving of bodies as much as ribbons, pairs stepping in and out, circling and crossing paths until the pole was dressed in a braid of colour. The participants weren't randomly chosen. Glances exchanged earlier in the day determined who danced with whom. A hand lingering a fraction longer on the ribbon was sometimes all the signal needed to arrange a meeting after dark. The soundscape is layered, drums low and steady, flutes darting between the beats, the occasional call from someone offering mugs of spiced ale. The ribbons snap softly in the breeze, and when the dancers pass near, you catch the scent of crushed flowers woven into hair. If you stand at the edge of the circle, you can watch alliances form and dissolve in the space of a song. Scholars debate whether these dances were primarily about matchmaking or about reinforcing community ties. Some argue that they offered sanctioned opportunities for flirtation under the watchful eye of the village, while others suggest the focus was on collective joy, with romantic pairings as a byproduct. Either way, the energy was unmistakable, an undercurrent that made the air feel lighter, the night more elastic. Quirky customs emerged from region to region. In some English villages, the maypole wasn't just for dancing, it was climbed by daring young men competing for small prizes tied to the top. In certain alpine regions, a bachelor might plant a decorated pole outside a woman's home as a declaration of interest. In both cases, the gesture mixed bravado with a hint of public claim, and the resulting gossip could fuel the next week's market chatter. From where you stand, the dance is hypnotic. Feet kick up dust in perfect counterpoint to the ribbons winding tighter around the pole. There's a rhythm to the weaving, and when the music shifts, the dancers reverse, unwinding what they've made, a quiet reminder that connections can loosen as easily as they form. You feel your own body swaying in time, even if you never touch a ribbon. The night deepens. Lanterns swing from posts, casting warm puddles of light across the grass. The music softens, replaced by scattered conversations and laughter that carries across the green. Somewhere in the shadows, a few pairs drift away, disappearing into the lanes that spiderweb out from the village heart. No one pretends not to notice, but no one comments either. It's part of the rhythm, as natural as the weaving and unweaving of ribbons. And when the last drumbeat fades, the maypole stands alone, dressed in its tangle of colours. Tomorrow, it will be just a pole again, a tall stick in the ground, with ribbons fluttering in the daylight. But tonight, it was a magnet for movement and glances, a reminder that even in the most tightly bound community, there's always a thread or two left loose, waiting to be picked up when the music plays again. The bed smells faintly of smoke and wool, but tonight it also holds something less tangible, luck, or so you've been told. Earlier in the day, you noticed your partner slipping away from the hearth and returning with an oddly lumpy pillow. Now, as you pull back the blanket, you feel it, a bundle tucked beneath the sheets, small enough to hide in a closed fist but heavy with meaning. In the medieval countryside, superstition wrapped itself around intimacy like ivy, and one of its strangest tendrils was the habit of placing charms in the bed to protect or enhance fertility. Archaeological digs in rural homes have uncovered tiny pouches, knotted cords, and even small carved tokens hidden near sleeping areas. These weren't decorative. They were working tools of folk belief, intended to ward off illness, bad luck, or an evil eye that might harm the couple's chances of conceiving. Some were stitched with symbols, others filled with herbs like rosemary, rue, or pennyroyal plants, thought to have power over the body in ways both protective and persuasive. Written notes from 14th century herbalists make it clear that these practices sat somewhere between medicine and magic. A sprig of vervain tied with red thread might be prescribed to encourage the seed to quicken, while certain stones were kept to turn away barren winds. The language is both poetic and opaque, which probably suited the people using it. Mystery was part of the charm's power. One story from an English village tells of a bride who slipped a coin minted in her birth year under the mattress to ensure that her own fortune would grow in the new household. In another, from the hills of Bohemia, couples placed a length of braided hair beneath their pillow, binding their lives together in a literal thread. These tokens were sometimes left in place for months, even years, renewed only when a birth, a death, or a sudden turn in luck demanded it. There's no consensus among historians about how much faith people placed in these objects versus the comfort they provided. Some argue that charms were primarily psychological small assurances in a world without much control over health or fate. Others see them as deeply spiritual, woven into a worldview where unseen forces shaped every aspect of life. Either way, the act of placing something under the sheets before a shared night carried an undeniable intimacy, a wordless message between two people. I want this to be safe, to be good, to last. The sensory side of the ritual was as important as the object itself. Imagine slipping into bed and catching the faint, peppery scent of crushed rue, or the sweet, grassy perfume of chamomile. The knot of thread might press lightly against your hand, reminding you it's there even in the dark. And if the bed creaked unexpectedly, perhaps you'd glance at each other and whisper a joke about the charm already working. Not all tokens were benevolent. In some cautionary tales, charms were planted by jealous rivals to sour a relationship. A knotted cord with 9 twists, hidden deep in the straw, might be blamed for sudden quarrels or a run of bad harvests. Such objects, once found, were sometimes burned in the hearth with prayers muttered under breath insurance against whatever unseen ill they carried. The practice even seeped into local law. One 15th century manor court record from northern England finds a woman for placing of ill-luck herbs in the bridal bed of another, which suggests not only that such sabotage was feared, but that it was taken seriously enough to punish. Folklore often exaggerates, but legal records tend to mean business. Tonight, the charm in your own bed is benign. It rests quietly under the linen, carrying its bundle of herbs and small bead carved from bone. Whether it works in any measurable way is beside the point. The point is that it was placed there for you, with care and intention, in a world where care itself is a precious currency. As you settle into the warmth, the tiny knot of fabric feels less like superstition and more like a promise one you can feel with your fingertips even as you drift towards sleep. The cottage is quiet except for the slow crackle of the hearth. Outside, the night deepens, and you know that before long, the household will sink into the peculiar rhythm of sleeping in shifts. To a modern ear, it sounds odd why break sleep into two parts. But in the medieval countryside, it was ordinary, as woven into life as the sound of the bell at vespers. The pattern went like this. After the evening meal, everyone would drift toward bed and sleep for a few hours. The first sleep. Then, sometime after midnight, you'd stir awake, not just from habit, but because the fire needed tending, the animals might need checking, or certain quiet tasks were best done while the village slept. This in-between period, called the watch or dead of night, could last an hour or more. Afterward, you'd return to bed for your second sleep, which carried you through to dawn. Records from early modern court testimonies and 13th–15th century household accounts make it clear that this segmented pattern was common enough to be unremarkable. The very phrase, first sleep, appears casually, without explanation, in letters and depositions, as if no one needed to be told what it meant. Medical texts of the time even advised on what to eat between the two sleeps to avoid indigestion, light bread and warm ale, if you could manage it. It's during that midnight interval that some of the village's most private encounters happened. With the younger children and elders still asleep, couples found themselves in a rare cocoon of quiet. You could talk without the constant hum of daily chores, share a cup of broth, or slip out under the stars for a walk down the frost-silvered lane. This was the hour for murmured stories, gentle teasing, and plans for the next day that might never survive the morning's bustle. Folklore gives the watch hour a faint shimmer of magic. In certain regions, people believed this was when dreams could spill over into waking, when prayers were most potent, and when intentions whispered aloud might travel farther. For couples, that lent the time a subtle charge, as if anything shared in the dark might be more binding. Some scholars suggest that this pattern also served practical needs. In households where space was scarce, waking in the middle of the night allowed for a rearranging of sleepers, a check on infants, or a rotation of who got the warmest spot by the fire. Others point to the agricultural calendar during lambing season, for example. Those midnight hours were ideal for checking the pens without disrupting the rest of the night. You can picture it now. The glow from the hearth, dim but steady, the smell of wood smoke mingled with the faint tang of wool blankets. Outside, the air is so still you can hear the creak under its thin crust of ice. Your partner stirs, stretches, and meets your eyes in the half-light. There's no need for words. The rhythm of the watch has been in your bones since childhood. You share a sip of ale, maybe a laugh about the neighbour's goose that escaped again, and then the silence folds back over you both. Eventually, you slip into the second sleep, the one that carries you toward the rooster's call. It's a deeper rest, less restless than the first, as if the body has already let go of its unease in that wakeful middle stretch. When morning comes, you rise into the day knowing you've shared not just a bed, but a rhythm, a quiet middle chapter that belongs only to those who live by the pattern of the land and the slow arc of the night. By the time winter's grip loosens and the days stretch past supper, the village is ready for something wild. That's when the carnival comes, an eruption of colour and noise before the solemnity of Lent closes in. For peasants, it's more than just a festival. It's the one time of year when rules wobble like a loose wheel on a cart, and the air itself seems to smell of mischief. The streets fill with masks, some carved from wood and painted in bright, crude strokes, others made from scraps of cloth sewn together into faces that grin or leer. Behind each mask, a neighbor you might recognize by their walk or their laugh, though for today you pretend not to. Musicians roam in loose packs, drummers with skins tight enough to wake the next village, pipers darting melodies in and out of the crowd like quick birds. The air carries roasted chestnuts, spilled ale, and the faint sharpness of smoke from torches waving above the heads of dancers. Accounts from 14th and 15th century towns describe Carnival as a world turned upside down. Social ranks blurred, servants dressed as lords, women as men, and the poorest might play judge in mock trials staged in the square. In rural districts, the festival sprawled beyond the streets into fields and barns, where plays and games tilted toward the bawdy. This was the annual safety valve for a community under constant watchfulness, an officially sanctioned rebellion against its own rigidity. One chronicle from Flanders tells of marriage markets during Carnival, where couples real or pretend were paired off by a self-appointed mayor of fools for the night. Sometimes these matches ended when the masks came off. Other times they became actual betrothals weeks later. It was a chance for courtship to bloom under cover of chaos, for shy glances to sharpen into open laughter without fear of disapproval. The sensory overload was part of the point. Imagine standing in the square at dusk. Torches flare against the deepening blue sky. Ribbons whip in the wind, and the drums are so loud they feel like they're inside your chest. You taste sweetness from a stolen bite of honey cake, hear the whoop of someone leaping over a barrel, smell the heady mix of sweat and spilled wine. It's dizzying, almost dreamlike, as if the world's edges have gone soft for the night. Not everyone approved, of course. Church sermons from the period rail against unseemly conduct and public lewdness during these days, warning that the devil walks most freely behind a mask. Yet the festivals persisted, shifting location or adjusting their dates when authorities tried to rein them in. People needed their carnival like they needed bread. Both fed a hunger that was more than physical. A curious regional twist appears in some alpine villages, where carnival included a procession of the bed. Young men carried a large wooden frame draped in blankets through the streets, inviting onlookers to climb in for a joke or a mock blessing. It was half comedy, half coded invitation, and entirely in the spirit of bending propriety until it creaked. Some historians see carnival as a form of controlled release, a temporary chaos that reinforced order once it ended. Others believe it was a genuine crack in the social fabric, a reminder that the boundaries could be shifted, even if just for a handful of days. Either way, it offered moments that might never have happened in the rigid daylight world. A masked dancer pulling you into the circle, a whispered joke that feels sharper because you can't see the speaker's eyes, the warm press of strangers in a space too small for so many bodies. By morning, the streets will be strewn with wilted flowers, broken ribbons, and the dregs of overturned mugs. Masks will hang from nails in the rafters until next year. But tonight, the village moves as one restless, laughing, slightly tipsy organism, shaking the dust from its bones before returning to the long, straight days of work. And if some connections made under the mask last beyond the festival, well, perhaps that's just another kind of blessing, wrapped in music and smoke. You hear the commotion long before you see it, boots thudding on packed earth, laughter that tips a little too loud, and a sharp cry that could be mock fear or the real thing. You step out into the lane and there they are, a knot of young men sweeping past with ribbons tied to their sleeves, a girl hoisted high for a heartbeat, then set down again as the crowd surges like a river around a rock. Someone yells, "Pay the ransom." Someone else brandishes a garland, and the whole village vibrates with that peculiar blend of festival and warning. Tonight's game is the oldest story with the messiest edges, marriage by capture, the playful kind that sometimes forgets it is supposed to stay playful. You trail them toward the green. The air smells of crushed thyme and lantern smoke, and the moon looks like a coin no one can reach. The girl's friends circle her like geese, hissing, defending, laughing, while the would-be captors perform exaggerated bows and plead for the honor of borrowing the bride. If you are thinking theatrics, you are not wrong. In plenty of European villages, wedding seasons came with mock abductions, staged chases, and ransom games. Shoes are stolen, veils are mislaid, and the bride herself goes missing for an artfully timed 10 minutes until someone produces a jug of ale or a promise of a larger feast. Village memory carries this as custom, the way a body carries a scar, visible, complicated, still tender if pressed. Legal records from the 13th to 15th centuries show the darker twin of this ritual. Courts across England, France, and parts of the Empire prosecuted raptus cases, abductions that slid into coerced marriage or worse. Church law after the 12th century made consent central to a valid union, and ecclesiastical courts could nullify marriages when that consent was absent. In the ink of those ledgers you can hear the other sound beneath tonight's drumbeat, the one no one wants to let drown out the music. The page is clear. Sometimes the game stopped being a game. But here, right now, the village insists on the festive script. A boy in a wreath blows a cracked horn. A cousin lays down the rules. The groom must find the missing bride by riddles shouted from different doorways. You grin despite yourself. Riddle 1 is so bad it should be fined by the manor court. Light joke number 1. You mutter that whoever wrote it owes everyone a new batch of ale for damages to the language. The groom sprints, breath-making little ghosts in the air, while the crowd fans out to hide hints under stools, inside hats, and once, with tremendous ceremony, beneath a sleepy cat. Song breaks out, the sort that thumps more than it harmonizes, and a pair of grandmothers start the clapping, beating time with wooden spoons. A girl tosses the groom's cap from hand to hand, each throw punctuated by demands. A promise for the midwife's new kettle, 2 wheels of cheese for the church roof, an extra barrel for the harvest feast. If ransom is a joke, it is also accounting. Weddings are community projects, and this rowdy ledger ensures everyone sees what is being invested in the union. Ethnographers who later collected village customs describe versions of this far beyond one valley. In some places, the bride's shoe is the hostage, paraded on a cushion until beer liberates it. Elsewhere, the bride herself is kidnapped to a neighbor's cottage where she is plied with sweet buns, while the groom negotiates her return in public, half farce, half proof that he can provide. You can almost hear the moral humming under the laughter. A marriage feeds more mouths than 2. The tricky part is intent. Some researchers read these rituals as symbolic rehearsals of an older reality, a domesticated echo of real abductions from an earlier age. Others see them as theatrical tests of generosity and resolve, a way to measure a groom's standing with wallets and wit rather than muscle. The field still has not settled on a single interpretation, and probably never will. Local practice is stubbornly local. What rings constant is the village's need to witness the crossing from single to wed, and to mark that crossing with noise. You catch up to the groom near the alehouse, where the loudest riddles are being broadcast from a window full of laughing faces. He is red-cheeked, determined, and not nearly as clever as he thinks he is. Light joke number 2. He declares he will follow his heart, then immediately runs the wrong direction, which is perhaps the most accurate metaphor for newlyweds anyone has performed. A chorus of aunts corrects him without mercy. He bows, recovers, and finally locates the bride, a triumphant reveal behind a curtain of drying linen, steam ghosting up from the tubs like applause. For a second the world shrinks. The crowd hushes. She steps forward, not so much rescued as choosing to be found, and places her hand on his wrist where the pulse runs. You can feel the ceremony under the horseplay in the way they hold each other's gaze. Consent, imperfectly staged, but insisted upon nonetheless. The cousins cheer, the wreath. Boy toots the horn again, which remains a sonic crime. Light joke number 3. You vow silently to steal that horn in the name of public peace. Then realize that would count as yet another abduction, and you have had enough felonies for one evening. The pair is led to the green where a rope is stretched low for a hurdle jump. He must lift her, clear the rope, and not drop her in the mud that everyone pretends is not waiting like a hungry mouth. On the first try, he stumbles, they teeter, and the rope-keeper wickedly raises it a finger higher. On the second, he finds his footing, and the collective intake of breath turns into shouts as they sail over, landing in a spray of damp earth and ribbon-tails. Mud streaks their boots. Pride shines from their faces. If the village wanted a picture of partnership, it has one. Somewhere between the laughter and the reclaimed shoe, someone slips a sprig of rue into the bride's palm, a quiet apotropaic gesture against envy and ill will. It is a tiny, pungent mercy, a reminder that even amid the jests, protection matters. A jug appears. The rim passes from hand to hand. The ransom has become a toast. The night pushes a little warmer around the circle. Walking home, your thoughts don't quite settle. The theatre has worked its charm. It has also exposed its seam. Custom can blur harm and humour until neither is easy to separate in the dark. Medieval villagers knew that too. That is why there are rules under the noise. Why elders watch the edges. Why the priest is conspicuously visible on the lane. And why the alehouse shutters are left open a hand's width. The ritual insists that a line exists, and that the village together keeps it. When the couple finally disappears into the maze of cottages, the green exhales. Ribbons snag in hedges, laughter fades into the smoke of banked hearths, and the moon climbs the last inch to the top of the church roof. What remains on the ground looks like the end of any party's scuffed footprints, a bent garland, the groom's cap rescued from its travels. What remains in the mind is thornier and more precious. The knowledge that union is public, that joy is policed by care, and that the oldest stories need chaperones as well as singers. The alehouse door stands open, spilling lamplight onto the lane and drawing you forward on the scent of malt and smoke. Inside, the room is a patchwork of rough-hewn tables, long benches polished by years of elbows, and low beams that force the tallest patrons to duck as they cross. A pot of something hearty simmers at the hearth, barley broth, maybe, and above it hangs a rack of mugs waiting to be filled. The air is loud with talk and laughter, but underneath it all hums the rhythm of tankards meeting tables, the heartbeat of every village evening. For all its noise, the alehouse is not chaos. It has its own choreography. Neighbours cluster according to trade, age or temperament. Farmers near the door so they can come and go. Craftsmen closer to the hearth. And at least one table claimed by women who come to trade news under the cover of buying beer to take home. The alewife, sharp-eyed and quick with her ladle, runs the room like a general, making sure no one's cup stays empty long enough to think about leaving. Guild records and manorial accounts confirm that alehouses were essential to medieval rural life, not just for drink but for gathering, bargaining, and hearing the day's unofficial news. Without taverns and inns in every hamlet, the alehouse filled the role of both cafe and community hall, where you might settle a debt, hear the latest on a neighbour's sick cow, or learn who was courting whom. The line between public and private blurred here. Conversation could turn from harvest prices to personal matters in the space of a swallow. The flicker of flirtation was part of the atmosphere, as familiar as the smell of hops. A sideways smile while passing a mug, a hand brushing another's when settling change, a joke told with eyes fixed a little too long. These were the small currents beneath the roar of voices. Couples might meet here as just neighbours, but leave having arranged to walk home the long way. In a culture with few sanctioned spaces for courting, the alehouse offered a warm, noisy cover for such beginnings. In one 15th century court record from Kent, a dispute over a marriage arrangement started when a young man was accused of over-familiar converse with a brewer's daughter during a busy market evening. His defence? He was only asking about the quality of her hops. The bench of elders fined him anyway, perhaps less for impropriety than for the crime of thinking anyone would believe the excuse. Not all alehouse courtship stayed light-hearted. Sometimes drink loosened tongues past the point of charm, and the alewife would intervene often by sliding a bucket of cold water onto the table with a pointed look. Some regional bylaws even gave alewives authority to eject anyone who disturbed the peace with importunities, a polite phrase for bothering people who weren't interested. Still, much of the intrigue here was unspoken. You sip your mug and watch the subtle patterns: who leans in, who leans away, whose laughter rises half a pitch when a certain person approaches. The smell of yeast and wood smoke clings to everyone equally, masking whatever scent might have been carried in from the lane. Somewhere in the background, a half-tuned lute is coaxing out a melody that keeps getting lost under the din. Ethnographers studying early modern rural life note that alehouses often doubled as neutral territory, one of the few places where someone from another village might mingle without causing comment. That opened the door to romances that crossed parish lines, which could be thrilling or problematic, depending on family alliances and rivalries. Here, in the golden lamplight, differences blur. Everyone's hands are calloused, everyone's boots are muddy, and everyone's eyes catch the firelight the same way. The quirks of the room add their own texture. A carved heart in the beam above the hearth with initials too faded to read. A patch on the bench where the wood is worn smooth from years of boots resting against it. A cluster of dried herbs hung over the door, not decoration but protection, a quiet nod to the alewife's own superstitions. These details root the space in the same way the ale does: solid, sustaining, and just intoxicating enough to let the edges of the world soften. You watch as a man offers his seat to a woman carrying a jug, then slips onto the bench beside her rather than returning to his friends. The exchange is brief, nothing more than a few words lost in the noise, but they rise together a short while later and head into the cool night. Whether it's a planned meeting or a chance spark, only they will know. By the time the fire burns low and the talk grows slower, the alehouse has done its work. It has warmed bodies and eased conversations, stitched a few more threads between people, and perhaps loosened others. Stepping back into the lane, the night feels quieter than it is. The muffled laughter inside clings to you like the smell of smoke in your hair. You walk home slower than you left, carrying the taste of malt on your tongue and the hum of a room where nothing is ever entirely just about the ale. The smell of fresh bread hits you before you even see the bakehouse. It's an early morning scent: yeast, wood smoke, and that deep, nutty sweetness of grain turning into something more than itself. You round the corner and there it is, a low, whitewashed building with a tall chimney exhaling in lazy spirals. The door is propped open to let the heat spill into the cool air, and inside, the baker and his helpers move with the precision of a well-rehearsed dance. But this isn't just a place for loaves and crusts. In the village imagination, bread and courtship have been kneaded together for as long as anyone remembers. Village lore ties bread to more than sustenance. It's a gift that travels easily between households, a token of goodwill, and, in the right hands, a quiet declaration. A small, well-shaped loaf, left at someone's doorstep, might mean nothing more than thanks for a favor, or it might mean something else entirely, depending on the giver's timing and the recipient's blush. In certain regions, a bread gift from an unmarried person to another unmarried person was the kind of gesture that drew whispers at the well the next morning. Household accounts from the 14th and 15th centuries sometimes list courtesy loaves, given outside of feast days. These appear in the margins of ledgers, often in the same hand that recorded wedding expenses months later. A sweetened bun, spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg if the household could afford such luxuries, carried a double weight. It was rare enough to be memorable and perishable enough to encourage a swift reply. The bakehouse itself could be a stage for subtler exchanges. You picture it now: flour dusting the air like first snow, the roar of the oven when the door swings open, the glow from within painting the bakers' faces in gold. Someone slips in to collect their order and lingers just a heartbeat too long, asking about the next batch. Hands brush while passing a basket. A comment about the weather turns into a story about last year's harvest, and in that warmth, literal and otherwise, the exchange feels private despite the clatter of paddles and the shuffle of feet. One charming account from a Devon village tells of a baker's apprentice who shaped a loaf into the rough outline of a heart, tucking it among the round ones in a basket for a girl who came to buy bread each week. Whether she noticed immediately or not, the record doesn't say, but the two married within the year, which the village no doubt took as proof of the bread's magic. Not all bread courtship was sweet. In some places, a poorly made loaf offered in jest was a way of teasing or even testing a potential partner's patience. One folkloric tale warns of a woman who rejected a suitor after he presented her with bread so hard it cracked a bench when dropped. Whether by accident or design remains unclear. Scholars who study rural humor point out that such exchanges were part of the courtship dance, revealing not only skill but wit. The link between bread and love also had a spiritual undertone. In Christian symbolism, bread was life itself, a gift from God, and sharing it could carry a sense of blessing. Giving someone bread from your own oven was a quiet way of saying you wanted them to be part of your table, your home, your daily sustenance. It's the kind of gesture that needed no explanation, because the meaning was baked in from the start. You imagine yourself slipping a warm loaf into someone's hands, feeling the heat pass between you along with the faint crunch of crust. Maybe you've scored the top with a simple cross, maybe with an intricate pattern that says more to them than anyone else would notice. They thank you, and the exchange is over in a moment, but the scent of it will follow them home, filling their kitchen and their thoughts in equal measure. As the morning wears on, the bakehouse settles into its rhythm. Loaves slide in and out of the oven, baskets change hands, and the chimney continues its slow, satisfied breathing. You leave with a round loaf tucked under your arm, still warm enough to steam in the cool air. Maybe it's for supper, maybe for someone else entirely. Either way, you can't help but notice that bread never travels alone. It carries with it a little of the hands that shaped it, and sometimes, just sometimes, a piece of the heart. The edge of the village melts into hedgerows and crooked oaks, the kind that twist their branches like old men leaning in to hear gossip. Beyond them lies the stretch everyone knows by its half-whispered name, the Forbidden Woods. They are not vast enough to be truly wild, but they hold a reputation part shadow, part story that keeps most people from venturing there alone, which of course makes them perfect for meetings you don't want your aunt or the reeve to see. By daylight, the woods are almost welcoming. Birdsong drips from the branches, the air is laced with the scent of pine and damp earth, and shafts of sunlight pierce the canopy in soft gold columns. But by twilight, the palette shifts, greens deepen to black. The undergrowth seems to move in the corner of your eye, and the silence grows thick enough to hear your own pulse. Couples who slip into these trees during festivals or long summer evenings know exactly why they've chosen this path. The woods keep secrets better than the alehouse, better than the barn, better than anywhere with a door someone might knock on. Parish gossip often featured the woods in a supporting role. She was seen returning from the copse with her hair loose. Could mean anything from an innocent stroll to a scandal in the making. In a few court testimonies from the 14th century, disputes over promises made under the green bough reveal that these wooded meetings sometimes carried as much social weight as a public vow if the right people heard about them afterward. Folklore wrapped the woods in a mix of caution and invitation. Certain glades were said to be blessed spots, where lovers' promises would hold fast. Others were hungry places, where stepping into the wrong ring of mushrooms could leave you cursed in love for a year. These tales served as both deterrent and dare, and the result was predictable. Those with bold hearts or curious minds found themselves testing which stories were true. One particularly vivid account from a rural Welsh village tells of a young man who left a posy of wildflowers in the hollow of an oak for a girl he'd been too shy to speak to in public. She found it, replied with a ribbon tied to the same branch, and over the summer, the two built an entire courtship in silent offerings before ever meeting face to face. When they finally did, it was under that same oak, with only the breeze for a witness. Researchers looking into medieval land use note that forbidden didn't always mean off-limits by law, it might simply mean the woods belonged to the lord's estate, making entry without permission technically poaching. The thrill of trespass added spice to the rendezvous. It also meant an unspoken rule. If you were caught, you claimed you were gathering firewood or mushrooms, even if your hands were suspiciously empty. The sensory pull of the woods is undeniable. You step under the canopy, and the village noise falls away. Leaves shift overhead in a low, constant murmur, as if the trees are holding their own counsel. The air smells cooler, heavier, carrying hints of moss and something sweet you can't quite name. Your boots press into the soft litter of last year's leaves, releasing a faint, dry sigh with every step. In that hush, words carry differently. A joke lands softer, a compliment feels sharper. You might share a crust of bread from your pocket, a sip from a flask, or simply lean back against the same tree, letting the shared silence do the work. Light joke number 1 might be a mock complaint about how the branches are conspiring to ruin your hair. Number 2 could be about the squirrels acting as unpaid chaperones. Number 3 is the exaggerated groan when you realize you'll have to pick twigs out of your cloak before facing anyone in the village. Not all woodland meetings end in romance. Some are negotiations over dowry terms, over borrowed tools, over whether a whispered rumor needs quashing. The woods are as useful for diplomacy as they are for courtship, yet the possibility lingers in every path, every clearing. Here, away from eyes and ears, you can say what you mean without it traveling faster than you walk. When you finally emerge back into the open, the light feels brighter than it should, as if the world has been turned up a notch. The village seems smaller after the stretch of shadow, and you carry a piece of that quiet with you, like a hidden talisman. Whether or not you've promised anything in the woods tonight, the trees will keep your visit, adding it to their slow-growing archive of footsteps and words no one else will hear. The sun hangs high, pressing its heat into the back of your neck until the air itself seems to hum. Out in the open fields, the wheat sways in slow, lazy arcs, and the only shade worth mentioning comes from the occasional tree at the far edge of a plot. Work is relentless in this light, hands on sickles, backs bent, arms dusted with golden chaff, but even in the hardest seasons there are pauses. And in those pauses, the fields can host their own quiet chapters of village courtship. By custom, midday brings a short break. It's not long, just enough to drink, eat, and let the muscles unclench before the second half of the day. Workers gather in loose groups under trees or near hedgerows, sharing bread, cheese, and whatever fruit is in season. But every so often 2 people will wander just far enough to be out of the immediate circle, sitting side by side with their backs to a haystack or lying in the grass watching clouds drift over the sun. The separation is noticed, of course. In a place where everyone knows the color of your boots, nothing goes unseen. But as long as they return when the horn sounds, no one says much. Evidence from manorial rolls and field labor accounts suggests that these pauses were often the only socially acceptable moments for unmarried men and women to talk without a chaperone. The worksite was public enough to guard reputations, but sprawling enough to allow for a corner of relative privacy. In some regions, it became an unspoken expectation. If you wanted to speak to someone you fancied, you timed it for the midday rest. Folklore, predictably, embroidered the practice. One Devonshire saying warned that a rest too long in the rye means gossip by the fire, while a Bavarian proverb claimed that couples who shared their meal under the same tree would be married within the year. Whether such outcomes were wishful thinking or actual trend is up for debate among folklorists. But the persistence of the sayings shows how closely the idea of love was tied to work in the communal mind. Picture the scene. The smell of crushed stalks, the low drone of bees in the clover at your feet, the rough texture of a half loaf of rye passed between you. Sweat dries in the breeze, and your shoulders unknot just enough to make you feel human again. You trade a few jokes, light joke number 1 about how the haystack would make a fine bed if it didn't itch so much. Number 2 about how the crows seem to be working harder than some of the men. Number 3 about how you'd gladly trade your sickle for a fishing rod, if only the reeve would allow it. These exchanges can be clumsy, funny, or quietly intense. Sometimes they are little more than a breather in good company. Other times they lay the first bricks of something more lasting, especially when the harvest season's long hours turn strangers into familiar faces and familiar faces into confidants. The rhythm of shared labor becomes a kind of background music, and the field itself turns into a witness mute, golden, and entirely unbothered by human schemes. Scholars of rural social life note that the fields were paradoxical spaces, the most open places in the village, yet also some of the most intimate. There are no walls, no doors, but the sheer expanse of land creates pockets of isolation, like islands in a sea of grain. These moments are fleeting once the break ends. You're back to the grind, and whatever was said or unsaid gets folded into the day's work. When the horn finally blows, you brush crumbs from your lap, sling your sickle over your shoulder, and rejoin the others. The sun is still fierce, the stalk still tall, and your muscles already ache at the thought of the next hours. But the work feels lighter, somehow, as if the field has lent you a little of its slow patience. And when you glance across the rows and catch the other person's eye, you know they've felt it too, a small, shared thread in the vast weave of the day. The village gate looms ahead, its timbers weathered to a silvery grey, and bound with iron straps that have rusted in intricate streaks. After sundown, it is the domain of the night watch, 2 or 3 men appointed to keep an eye on comings and goings, mind the curfew, and ensure no one is wandering in with trouble on their heels. In theory, their role is all business. Watch the road, keep the peace. In practice, the gate is also a stage for late-night meetings that have very little to do with patrol duty. From the watchman's vantage point, the road stretches away into darkness, flanked by the pale shapes of hedges and the darker lumps of trees. The quiet out here is different from the quiet of the woods or the fields. It is taut, expectant, as if holding its breath for a distant cartwheel or the bay of a dog. The watchmen know every sound, the click of a latch, the slap of shoes on packed earth, and they notice when footsteps pause just shy of the torchlight. That's when the game begins. Town and manorial records occasionally mention meetings at the gate, in depositions, sometimes framed as harmless, sometimes as a cause for scandal. The gate offered plausible deniability. You could claim you were delivering a message, returning from an errand, or simply checking the road. And yet, it was well understood that a softly exchanged word, or the passing of a small parcel, could be the real reason for lingering in the shadow of the arch. Imagine the scene on a mild summer night. The torches sputter in their brackets, drawing moths that flicker in and out of the flame. A watchman leans on his spear, trading lazy banter with his partner. You approach from the lane, the cool air smelling faintly of cut hay. Somewhere in the dark, someone is waiting for you, maybe in the deeper shade by the gatepost, maybe already talking to the watch in a voice pitched low. The sensory texture is thick. The creak of the gate hinges when the wind nudges them, the crunch of gravel under a shifting foot, the glow of the torch catching on a silver clasp or the curve of a cheek. A meeting here is a mix of caution and thrill. Anyone could walk up at any moment, but the space is too public for anything overt. The value lies in the sliver of time it offers, a few words or a glance wrapped in the excuse of chance encounter. Folklore treats the night watch as half guardians, half gossip brokers. In one Lincolnshire tale, a watchman was said to have matched 3 couples in a single summer by accidentally arranging their paths to cross at the gate. In another, from a Provençal village, the watch had to chase away a pair so many times that they finally ordered the gate locked earlier just to get some rest. Whether benevolent or meddlesome, the watch was part of the dance. Historians looking at municipal life in small settlements point out that gates were also liminal spaces, thresholds between the safety of home and the uncertainty of the outside. Meeting there carried symbolic weight. Your conversation existed in neither the public square nor the wild beyond, but in the in-between. That ambiguity gave such encounters a flavour that neither a barn nor a hearth could match. Light joke number 1 might be a whispered claim that you're simply checking the hinges for rust. Number 2 could be an exaggerated salute to the watch as you pass, as if you're the visiting lord inspecting his walls. Number 3 might be to remark, when your companion finally appears, that they're just in time for the changing of the guard, even if there's only one sleepy man leaning on a spear. The meeting, when it happens, is quick 2 or 3 minutes maybe. You exchange news, slip a folded scrap of parchment from one hand to another, or simply share a look that says more than words would. Then, before the quiet stretches too long, you step away, letting the night close back over the space you've left. The watch resumes their rhythm. The torch flares once in the breeze, and the gate stands exactly as it did before, unchanged in shape, but holding your moment like a stone holds the memory of the sun. A low table near the hearth is scattered with stems of herbs, some bundled neatly with twine, others lying loose as if they've just been plucked from the garden. The smell in the room is sharp and layered. Rosemary's piney bite, the earthy bitterness of mugwort, the faint sweetness of marjoram. An old woman sits hunched over the bundles, fingers moving with patient skill, knotting and twisting the stems into patterns only she seems to understand. In the village, she is known for more than her midwifery or her skill with poultices. She is also the keeper of charms against straying hearts. In a world where loyalty can be tested by distance, harvest feasts, or the pull of a new face at market, people turn to quiet protections. These charms are not loud proclamations. They are meant to work in the background, slipped into a sleeve hem, stitched into a mattress seam, or hung behind a door frame where the wind can pass over them. They might be meant to bind affection, to ward off rivals, or to remind a wandering partner that their place is here, not elsewhere. Inventories from 14th and 15th century rural households occasionally list small packets or knotted cords alongside practical goods. In some cases, these were recorded after a death, when possessions were divided. In others, they appear in disputes, where one party accused another of casting knots to sour a relationship. The line between folk remedy and magic was thin, and crossing it could lead to anything from gossip to a summons before the manorial court. Quirky details from folk tradition abound. In parts of Brittany, a ribbon tied in 3 tight knots was hidden under the bed to hold a man's gaze in the home. In the Low Countries, women sometimes baked a small, hard biscuit with an herb pressed into it and slipped it into their partner's satchel. The taste of it meant to remind him of home. And in one Irish village tale, a jealous suitor buried a carved wooden heart in the garden of his rival, hoping the root would wither his chances. Not all of this was taken lightly. Ecclesiastical records reveal sermons warning against binding the will through unnatural means, and while the church might have frowned, the reality was that such practices persisted in quiet corners. For some, these charms were nothing more than tokens of care, like a favor tied to a knight's arm. For others, they were serious safeguards, as necessary as locking the door at night. You imagine one being made, the table lit by a single candle, shadows swaying across the bundles of herbs. Fingers select the right sprigs, maybe basil for faithfulness, maybe thyme for courage, and wind them together with red thread, chosen for its color's reputation as a shield. The knot is tied slowly, the ends trimmed neatly, the packet small enough to hide in a fold of cloth. Light joke number 1. The knot maker mutters that if this charm doesn't work, nothing will except maybe a bigger dowry. Number 2. A friend asks if they can make one to keep their goat from wandering, which earns them an arch look. Number 3. Someone suggests putting 2 charms in one bed, just to be safe. A level of redundancy the charm. Maker deems amusing but unnecessary. Some historians suggest that charms against infidelity may have served more as public signals than private tools. If a partner knew such a charm had been placed, it might serve as a reminder, a visible or whispered warning not to test the limits of trust. Others argue that secrecy was the point, the magic working best when unseen. The truth probably lay somewhere in between, shaped by the personality of the person who made it. As you watch the bundle tied off and tucked carefully away, you realize that the gesture carries more than superstition. It's a statement of investment time, skill, belief in a bond that is vulnerable simply because it's human. In a village where everyone knows your business and temptation can travel on the same road as the market cart, a charm is as much about reassurance as prevention. You leave the room with the scent of rosemary still clinging to you, wondering if, somewhere in your own bedding, a knot waits quietly, doing its work. The air in the square is busy with voices, but a shift in tone draws your attention, a ripple of laughter from the group near the well, the kind that says something a little daring has just happened. You look closer and see it, a man bending low to brush his lips against a woman's cheek, lingering just long enough to make her blush and the onlookers smirk. In the medieval village, a kiss was not just a kiss. It carried a vocabulary of its own, a set of unspoken rules everyone understood, even if no one could recite them outright. In some regions, a kiss on the cheek was pure courtesy, given as a greeting between kin or close friends. On feast days or at weddings, it could be a public blessing, two people sealing goodwill in front of witnesses, but move that kiss to the lips, and the message shifted sharply. Accounts from 14th and 15th century court depositions make it clear that a mouth-to-mouth kiss between an unmarried man and woman could be cited as evidence of betrothal, especially if it happened in front of others. The act itself wasn't legally binding, but the community's memory often made it so. A handful of civic ordinances even attempted to regulate kissing in public. In certain Italian towns, young couples were fined for immodest display if caught embracing too boldly in the streets. Meanwhile, in parts of northern France, it was considered good manners for a host to greet honored guests with a kiss, though what counted as honored often slid toward desired when no one was looking too closely. There was a courtship strategy in the subtleties. A kiss given during a dance might be brushed off as part of the steps, yet it could be the signal that two people had crossed a threshold. A kiss offered during a churchyard conversation could be framed as a blessing, but in the eyes of village gossip, it might as well have been a wedding announcement. And a kiss stolen at market behind the shelter of a bread stall, or beside the noise of a livestock pen, could feed speculation for weeks. Folk tradition added its own layers. In some English shires, a kiss under a certain hawthorn tree was said to bind a couple for a year and a day. In a Welsh village tale, two rivals for a woman's affection agreed to settle the matter with a contest of kisses, which, if the storyteller is to be believed, ended with the woman marrying neither, claiming her lips were worn out from the effort. Light joke number 1. Someone says that a peck on the cheek is safe unless it leaves crumbs from the bread you were eating. Number 2. A wry comment that winter kisses last longer because no one wants to pull away from the warmth. Number 3. The observation that in a crowd, it's impossible to tell whether a kiss is meant for you until it happens, and by then, you're committed to it. Scholars of social customs point out that kissing in the medieval world occupied a space between the private and the public. Unlike a whispered word or a hidden letter, a kiss was visible, physical proof of connection, and in a community where reputations were a kind of currency, that visibility mattered. Even the smallest gesture could be replayed in the telling, embroidered with each retelling until it bore little resemblance to what actually happened. You watch as the woman by the well touches her cheek where the kiss landed, half smiling as she turns back to her bucket. The man steps away, collecting a few approving nods from his companions. The crowd's energy shifts, the moment folded back into the daily noise. But you know it will be remembered tonight by the fire, tomorrow in the weaving shed, next week when someone sees them walking together. A kiss, after all, was never just the meeting of lips. It was a message, one that travelled far beyond the moment it was given. Frost crunches underfoot as you make your way down the narrow lane, breath turning to smoke in the bitter air. In the village, winter is a season that tests both the pantry and the heart. It's the time when woodpiles shrink faster than you'd like, when the roof groans under snow, and when bodies instinctively draw closer, sometimes for warmth, sometimes for something more. Among peasants, the cold months gave rise to an arrangement both practical and quietly romantic, the winter cuddling pact. Not every household could keep a fire blazing day and night. Fuel was costly in labor if not in coin, and warmth was rationed as carefully as grain. In such conditions, sharing a bed was less about propriety and more about survival. Two sets of shoulders under one blanket meant more heat trapped, fewer logs burned, and a better chance of making it through to dawn without waking numb. Married couples had this by default. but unmarried villagers sometimes entered into temporary bed-sharing agreements during the coldest weeks, a kind of seasonal partnership that blurred the lines between convenience and courtship. Manorial court roles occasionally reference these arrangements obliquely, noting fines for keeping house together without bond when a pact was deemed too cozy or lasted beyond winter's end. More often they passed without official notice, so long as both parties returned to their own hearths when the thaw came. In certain alpine villages, there was even a term for it loosely translating to snow spouse, acknowledging that what happened under the quilts in January might be forgotten by May. Folklore gave these pacts their own set of playful rules. A partner who hogged the blankets was said to steal the spring from the other. One who kept their feet cold on purpose to start a tussle was inviting the fox into the den. In some places, a shared cup of warm ale before bed was part of the ritual, the drink laced with honey or herbs to sweeten the night. Whether those herbs were for flavor or for other effects is a matter historians still debate. The sensory world of a winter bed is vivid. The blanket is heavy, woven from coarse wool that smells faintly of lanolin and smoke. Beneath it, you can hear the slow, deep breathing of the person beside you. Feel the heat radiating from their skin into the chill air between you. Outside, the wind combs through the thatch, and somewhere down the lane, a dog barks once before, curling back into its own warmth. The darkness feels thicker than in summer, the hours longer, the closeness more deliberate. Light joke number 1, a muttered complaint about elbows as weapons of winter warfare. Number 2, an observation that the only reliable alarm clock in January is someone's cold toes. Number 3, the claim that you're not sharing the bed for heat at all. It's just a strategic alliance against ghosts, which, you insist, are more active in deep winter. Not every winter pact ended neatly. Sometimes the intimacy kindled over the cold months carried into spring, leading to formal courtship or even marriage. Other times it dissolved with the ice, leaving only a few awkward nods at market and a shared memory tucked under layers of daily routine. In the rare cases where one party wanted to continue and the other did not, gossip could sting almost as sharply as frostbite. Ethnographers studying these arrangements note that they offered a sanctioned break from the otherwise rigid boundaries between unmarried men and women. The winter pacts acknowledged a simple truth: human beings, like the animals in their byres, fared better in company. The difference lay in what happened after the snow melted, whether the pact remained a footnote in the village year or turned into the prologue of something more enduring. As the night stretches on, you turn beneath the blankets, catching the faint scent of the herb sprig tucked into the bed earlier, perhaps for luck, perhaps for warmth, perhaps for nothing more than habit. The person beside you shifts, murmuring something too soft to catch. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters, but in here, the cold has stopped at the threshold. For now, the pact is holding, and in the deep stillness of winter, that feels like more than enough. The wooden bucket thumps softly against the well wall as you pull it up, water sloshing and flashing silver in the morning light. In your hands, the rope leaves faint traces of hemp fibers, and the chill of the water bites even before you've poured it into the copper basin by the hearth. Today is not a feast day or a wedding day, but in your household there's a small ritual all the same: the evening wash before bed. In the medieval village, bathing in the full sense was rare. Water was fetched for drinking, cooking, brewing, and only then for washing. A plunge into a bathhouse tub might happen once in a fortnight, but rinsing before sleep was a quiet luxury that, if you could afford the fuel and time, felt almost extravagant. It was not only about removing the day's dirt, it was a signal that the day was truly done, the work laid aside, and rest allowed to claim you. Household records and personal letters from the 14th and 15th centuries reveal glimpses of these moments. A servant heating water scented with mint or lavender, if such herbs were available, a cloth set aside for drying, the flicker of lamplight catching on the surface of the basin. In some wealthier rural homes, the washing was done in a small wooden tub, but for most peasants, it was a basin, or even a bucket, with water poured over hands, face, and feet before slipping between the blankets. There was a practical courtship angle here. Sharing a wash, whether by helping fetch the water, heating it, or offering the scented herbs, was a gesture of care. It might be as simple as wringing out a warm cloth for someone else's hands, or as intimate as washing their hair by the fire. In certain court testimonies, these shared tasks were remembered years later, as though they marked a shift from acquaintance to something deeper. Folklore tied washing to both health and luck. In some regions, it was said that washing the face together on certain feast eves could bind the year's fortune for a couple. In others, rinsing the feet before bed was believed to keep away nightmares or to invite pleasant dreams if rosemary was added to the water. Whether true or not, the belief added a faint glow to what might otherwise have been an ordinary task. You picture it in the sensory layers. The steam rising from the basin, carrying the clean green note of mint leaves. The way your fingers redden slightly in the warm water before cooling in the night air. The hiss as a log settles in the hearth. The person beside you leans forward to dip the cloth again, their knuckles brushing yours. Light joke number 1. You remark that they've splashed more on the floor than on themselves. Number 2. They claim the water is too hot, and you suggest they're as delicate as a goose egg. Number 3. A shared laugh at the thought of using ale for washing, if only the brewer would allow it. Some historians argue that such rituals carried a subtle social message. Cleanliness before bed could signal respect for oneself and one's partner, just as neglecting it might be read as indifference. Others caution that this interpretation might be a modern projection. For many, the act was simply about comfort after a long day of labor. But either way, there's no denying that preparing and sharing warm water was a quiet act of generosity, the kind that lingered in the memory. When the basin is emptied and the cloths hung to dry, the room smells faintly of damp linen and whatever herbs you've used. The day's grit has been washed from your skin, and the heat from the fire has soaked into your bones. You crawl into bed under the weight of wool blankets, the last sensation on your hands still that faint, slippery smoothness from the warm water. Beside you, someone shifts closer, their own skin warm from the same ritual. The air outside may be cold, but here, in the small radius of the bed, the night feels settled and clean. The firelight flickers across the rough-hewn beams of the hall, casting shadows that stretch like long fingers over the packed earth floor. Tonight, there is no feast, no priest, no village elder presiding, only 2 people, hands clasped, speaking words that will bind them for a year. This is handfasting, the trial marriage of medieval custom, and in many rural places it carried the same weight as a church wedding, at least for its set span of time. Handfasting was as straightforward as it was flexible. 2 people would agree to live together as a couple for a year and a day, after which they could part without penalty or choose to formalize their bond before the altar. It was a practical arrangement in a world where marriage tied not only hearts but property, labor, and family alliances. In some regions, a witness or 2 was enough to make it official. In others, the couple tied their own hands with a ribbon or strip of cloth, a symbolic knot to be untied only by mutual consent or by the year's end. Written references in manorial rolls and parish notes describe handfasting as common in areas where access to a priest was limited, especially in winter when roads turned to mud and travel was difficult. For the poor, it was also cheaper, no formal dowry exchange, no wedding feast to feed the entire village. But cheaper didn't mean less significant. For many, the year-long trial was a chance to prove compatibility in work as well as affection. Could they keep a household, tend the land, survive the lean months together? Folk traditions surrounded the practice with small rituals. In some places, the couple would exchange tokens: a spoon carved from bone, a small loaf of bread, a lock of hair. In others, they'd share a cup of ale, each taking a sip while looking into the other's eyes. The cup might then be broken, ensuring no one else could drink from it and steal the bond. Picture the scene. The hall is warm from the fire, the smell of peat smoke mingling with the faint sweetness of drying apples strung above the hearth. The ribbon, perhaps dyed red for luck, loops loosely around the couple's joined hands. Someone, maybe a friend, Maybe an aunt, with a soft spot for ceremony, says a few words about patience and kindness. Light joke number 1. A cousin calls out that they should also promise to share the bed covers equally. Number 2. Someone else reminds them that a year and a day will feel twice as long if one of them snores. Number 3. The ale is passed around and someone swears the cup grows heavier after each sip, proof the bond is working already. Historians are divided on how legally binding handfasting truly was. Some argue it was a fully recognized form of marriage in its own right, requiring formal separation if broken early. Others see it as a folk custom with no official standing beyond the village's agreement to respect it. What's certain is that many hand-fasted couples never felt the need to take vows in church afterward once a life was built together. Why start over? When the ribbon is finally untied, it's folded and kept in a chest or tucked between the pages of a family Bible. The couple leaves the hall hand in hand, stepping into the crisp night air, their breath curling into the dark. The agreement is simple. Share the work, share the food, share the bed, and see where the year leads. The village will watch kindly, curiously, sometimes nosily, but for now, the only witnesses that matter are the ones who stood in the firelight when the ribbon was tied. The wind at the edge of the square catches the corner of a wool cloak and flips it like a flag. Across the open space, people are already moving homeward, baskets heavier, purses lighter, but your attention is snagged by the woman near the lane's mouth. She's not calling out or waving. She's adjusting the folds of her headscarf in a way so deliberate that it might as well be a lantern in the night. In the medieval village, clothing is not only necessity or ornament, it is a codebook written in wool, linen, and leather, and those who can read it know more than they're told. Colour is the first signal. Dyed cloth costs labour and coin, so the shade a person wears speaks before they do. A flash of madder red might mean a garment saved for feast days or, in some cases, for catching the eye of someone specific. Blue, especially the deep woad-dyed kind, can hint at a family willing to spend on display. Even undyed brown or grey has its voice. It says either thrift or a deliberate modesty, a choice to blend into the crowd until the moment calls for standing out. Records from late medieval sumptuary laws, intended to restrict who could wear what, reveal just how closely clothing and status were linked. In some towns, only certain households could wear fur trims or silk veils. In others, specific colours were reserved for particular ranks. Of course, villages found their own ways to bend those rules. A sleeve lining might be dyed a forbidden shade, showing only when the arm was raised just so. A belt buckle might carry a carved emblem that signaled family ties or romantic interest to those in the know. Shape is the next layer of language. A tucked sleeve might indicate readiness for work, but if it stays tucked long after the work is done, it suggests the wearer wants to appear unencumbered, ready to engage. A loosened lacing at the neck might simply be for comfort, or it might be a calculated breach of modesty's line. In one court record from Yorkshire, a witness swore that a young man drew his cap low and his hose tight when walking past a certain girl's cottage, a combination the clerk recorded without comment, but which local gossip almost certainly did not ignore. Accessories carry messages too subtle for the untrained eye. A ribbon tied around a wrist instead of in hair, a brooch pinned on the right rather than the left shoulder, a pouch worn forward instead of to the side, each could mean nothing or everything, depending on context. Folk tradition in parts of the Low Countries held that a woman who shifted her belt knot to the opposite hip was declaring herself open to suitors, while in some alpine villages, a man might wear his cap feather turned forward as a signal of intent. Quirky detail to file away. In one Devon manor's accounts, a fine was levied against a man who wore his boots reversed, left boot on right foot and right on left, as a public joke meant to show he'd been turned around by a certain woman's attention. Whether she laughed or not, the record doesn't say. You imagine it now, standing in the bustle of Market's End, watching as someone adjusts a sleeve more times than necessary, or pauses to retie a cord with exaggerated care. Light joke number 1. You think of how dangerous it would be if every loose button in the village were taken as a declaration of love. Number 2. A muttered observation that some people would need an entire handbook to keep from making accidental proposals with their hat. Number 3. The idea of a village fashion police, deputized to write citations for overly suggestive cloak swirls. Historians debate whether these signals were deliberate courtship tools or simply everyday adjustments later romanticized in memory. Some argue that reading them as coded love notes is projecting modern ideas onto medieval habit. Others counter that in small, close-knit communities, people learned to squeeze meaning out of even the smallest gestures because opportunity for open declaration was rare. The truth is likely tangled in both. Sometimes a sleeve tug is just a sleeve tug, and sometimes it's a wordless invitation. The light begins to soften into that gold hour when shadows stretch long. As stalls are packed and the air cools, you catch the same hand adjusting the same scarf one more time. But now the glance that follows it lands squarely on you. There's no smile, just a stillness, a kind of waiting. You respond without stepping closer. A small shift of your own cloak, enough to show the lining's unexpected color, then you turn away with the rest of the crowd. The answer, if there is one, will come in the days ahead. Walking home, you think about how much is said without a word. The village reads these signals the way it reads weather. A flick of cloth is a wind shift, a hat angle, a change in pressure. Some of it is noise, some of it is news, and if you pay attention, you might just forecast your own fortunes. The code book of clothing is never officially written, but it is memorized all the same, passed down through watchful eyes, whispered at hearths, and worn into the fabric until the threads themselves seem to carry meaning. The square is quieter now, emptied of stalls and traders, but the mood has shifted. A small crowd gathers near the pillory, two stout wooden uprights with a hinged crosspiece, its iron fittings glinting dull in the afternoon light. Public punishment in the medieval village was not merely about discipline, it was performance. Everyone knew when someone was due to be put in the stocks or the pillory, and everyone knew why. And when the offence involved lust or indiscretion, the spectacle took on a particular edge. Parish records and manorial court rolls preserved the dry phrasing. For lewd conduct in the lane, for unlawful bedding, for unseemly touching at the feast. In life, these moments were anything but dry. The offender was led to the square, often with a rope looped loosely around the wrist, followed by the curious and the gleeful. Sometimes a crier announced the misdeed in a voice loud enough to reach the alehouse door. The punishment was public shaming, and its effectiveness relied on as many eyes as possible being there to see it. The device itself was simple. Stocks held the ankles, the pillory held the head and hands. In either case, the person was fixed in place for hours, sometimes longer. Neighbors might pass by and deliver sharp words, a handful of straw, or the occasional piece of overripe fruit. In some regions, offenders convicted of improper conduct were made to wear symbolic signs, a wooden plaque with painted words, a garland of nettles, or even a crude hat meant to provoke laughter. One unusual account from a Norfolk court roll describes a man punished for boasting too freely of imagined conquests. The village made him stand with a rooster tied to his arm, a living, flapping metaphor for his unchecked crowing. Another record from a small Flemish town notes a woman seated backward on a donkey, paraded through the streets before being locked in the pillory, her crime being a too public kiss with a man not her husband. These punishments were designed not just to humiliate, but to tell a story everyone would remember. The sensory scene was part of the lesson. You'd hear the creak of the wooden beams, the shuffle of onlookers adjusting their view, the murmurs growing into open commentary. The smell might be of mud, sweat, and the refuse tossed at the prisoner's feet. And above all, you'd feel the strange blend of tension and festivity, justice as communal theatre. Light joke number 1. A boy whispering that the rooster seems to be enjoying the punishment more than the man. Number 2. An old woman declaring she's seen better acting in the mummers' plays. Number 3. Someone offering the pilloried a mug of ale, for the thirst brought on by sin, only to pull it away at the last second. Scholars of medieval law often debate whether such public punishments were effective deterrents or simply reinforced the village's appetite for spectacle. Some point to records showing repeat offenders, arguing the shame faded faster than expected. Others counter that the threat of being physically displayed, frozen in a moment of disgrace, was enough to keep most people cautious. Either way, the memory lingered in the collective mind, becoming part of the village's moral map. The crowd's role was not passive. Laughter, jeers, or even silent staring all contributed to the weight of the punishment. Sometimes, friends or family would stand nearby to offer quiet comfort, though this could draw them into the scorn as well. In rare cases, a show of defiance by the punished meeting every gaze, smiling, even cracking jokes could soften the blow or turn the crowd's mood. These moments became legend, retold for years with embellishments that blurred truth and performance. By the time the constable unlocks the device, the light is already fading. The offender steps away stiffly, rubbing wrists or ankles, eyes flicking between the ground and the faces around them. The square slowly empties, but the story will walk home with every person there, to be repeated by the fire and reshaped in the retelling. The pillory stands silent again, waiting for the next name to be called, its wood worn smooth by the passage of shame, laughter, and the endless curiosity of a small community. The harvest is long finished, and the evenings stretch out like a well-worn road. Tonight, you find yourself at the edge of the common hall, where a small circle of villagers leans in toward the glow of the hearth. Someone strums a lute, another taps a drum with 2 fingers, and the talk between songs is a warm mix of teasing and memory. Then, as if the air has been waiting for it, a voice begins a melody slow at first, then rolling forward like a cart on a gentle slope. The song is familiar, but the way it's sung makes the older women glance at one another and the younger ones smirk. In the medieval countryside, folk songs were as much social currency as entertainment. Some were ballads of kings and saints, others tales of war or hard winters, but a whole subgenre carried a different freight, playful or suggestive verses that everyone pretended not to notice. These songs of suggestion lived in the spaces between the lines, where words could tilt one way for the innocent and another for those who listened harder. Collections of late medieval lyrics, preserved in monastic manuscripts despite their cheek, include refrains about weaving that sound like domestic chores, until you catch the shift in rhythm that makes shuttle and loom sound suspiciously like something else. A harvest song might celebrate gathering the last sheaf, in a way that makes the room warmer than the fire alone. The beauty of such songs was plausible deniability. A singer could claim innocence while letting the listeners supply the rest. One example from a 15th century English miscellany describes a young man offering to help a girl carry her apples to market, warning that the load might be too much for her alone. In the next verse, the apples have become roses, and the market the garden. And by then the audience is laughing in a way that has nothing to do with horticulture. Light joke number 1. An old farmer mutters that he's never seen a loom act that way in his life. Number 2. A woman claims she now has to inspect every apple in her basket before selling it. Number 3. A young man asks if there's a verse about mending boots because he's suddenly very interested in cobbling. Some ethnomusicologists suggest that these songs served as coded language for courtship in communities where direct speech about desire was frowned upon. Others argue that they were simply a release valve, an opportunity for harmless fun in long winters. In either case, the structure was intentional, familiar enough to be safe, flexible enough to allow improvisation that could steer the tone toward flirtation or back to innocence as the crowd required. The sensory world of these performances is vivid. The fire pops and hisses, shadows sway across the faces leaning closer to hear. The smell of ale and roasting chestnuts mingles with the faint tang of wool cloaks drying in the heat. The lute strings buzz just a little when the singer leans into a particularly loaded line, and the audience responds with a ripple of chuckles or a knowing silence. It's not always the lyrics themselves, but the delivery that carries the weight. A pause before a certain word, a glance across the room, a smile that widens just enough to confirm the double meaning. These are the craft of the seasoned performer. In small villages, Everyone knows who can pull it off and who will turn beet red halfway through the verse. That unpredictability is part of the fun. By the time the song ends, the room has shifted. The mood is looser, conversations louder, and somewhere in the back, two people are leaning close, speaking in voices the song has made braver. The singer passes the lute to another, who launches into something safe and familiar. But the earlier verses still hum in the air like the echo of a bell. You step outside into the night, the last notes following you into the crisp darkness. Overhead, the stars look sharper than they did when you arrived, and you realize the warmth you're carrying home isn't only from the fire. Songs, after all, have a way of settling under the skin, especially when they say more than they seem to. The lane to the midwife's cottage is narrow, hemmed in by hawthorn and nettle, and smells faintly of damp straw. You follow it past a leaning fence and find the door standing open just enough for voices to slip out. Inside, the air is warm and thick with the scent of dried herbs, sage hanging from the beams, lavender tucked into baskets, a pot of something sharp and medicinal bubbling near the hearth. The midwife sits at a low table, sorting through bundles of cord and clean linen, her hands as sure as a farmer's in harvest. She's been at this work for decades, and she knows more than most about every family in the parish. In a village where privacy is rare, the midwife stands in a unique position. She attends the beginnings of life and, often, its ends. She knows which babies were conceived after a wedding, and which before, whose labour was eased by a husband's gentle care, and whose was shadowed by tension. The role demands discretion, but the reality is more complex. Birth attendants often became unofficial keepers of the village's most delicate truths, and those truths had a way of surfacing in unexpected moments. Parish accounts and personal letters from the late Middle Ages occasionally reveal midwives as intermediaries in courtship and marriage disputes. One record from a Norfolk manor court mentions a midwife testifying about the good understanding between a couple months before their wedding, a detail clearly meant to support a claim of legitimate betrothal. Another, from rural Brittany, describes a midwife carrying messages between a young woman confined at home and the man petitioning for her hand messages disguised as herbal prescriptions. Folklore also tangled midwives with superstition. In some regions, they were believed to have charms that could encourage fertility, or if angered, withhold it. Quirky example. A 15th-century village rhyme warned, "Keep the midwife in your cheer, lest your cradle stay too near." Whether taken seriously or in jest, it reinforced the midwife's quiet power over the rhythms of love and lineage. You imagine sitting in her cottage on a winter evening. The fire snaps. The pot on the hearth releases a curl of steam scented with mint. She dips a cloth into warm water, wrings it out with practiced care, and, between instructions on easing a cough, tells you without telling you who's been walking together after Vespers. Light joke number 1. She remarks that she only notices such things for health reasons. Number 2. She claims the best remedy for lovesickness is a brisk walk and someone worth walking with. Number 3. She says she'll mix you a draught for shyness, though she hasn't found the right herb yet. Historians studying women's roles in rural communities note that midwives often occupied a rare middle ground, respected for their skill, yet woven into the same networks of gossip and alliance as any other villager. Their work gave them access to the most intimate spaces, bedrooms, birthing stools, whispered confessions in the heat of labor. That access made them witnesses not only to physical events, but to the emotional currents beneath them. There was risk in that position. A midwife accused of breaking confidences could find her reputation unraveling, and with it her livelihood. Yet many seem to have walked the line adeptly, passing on information only in the form of general observations or helpful advice that happened to be timely. In a village where words could ripple faster than the stream, this ability to shape the flow without being seen as its source was a kind of mastery. As the evening deepens, the midwife finishes tying her herb bundles and hangs them from the rafters. She asks about your family in a way that feels casual but covers a lot of ground: who's well, who's away, who's been keeping company with whom. You leave with a pouch of dried chamomile and a sense that she now knows more about your plans than you do yourself. The lane feels narrower in the dark, the hawthorn whispering on either side, and you can't quite shake the feeling that the midwife's knowledge travels with you, tucked into the folds of the herbs like a scent that will not fade. The rain has stopped, leaving the thatch roofs dripping and the cobbles slick. You're making your way past the old well when you see a knot of people gathered near the corner where two lanes meet. At the centre stands a young man looking sheepish, a small cloth pouch in his hands. The older woman across from him holds it like it's a nettle she can't quite decide to drop. Something has gone wrong with a love charm, and the entire square is interested. In the medieval village, charms to attract affection or to bind it tighter were part of the fabric of life. Herbs tucked into a pocket, ribbons knotted with whispered words, wax figures hidden under a bed. Each carried the promise of bending fortune in one's favor. But like bread left too long in the oven, these charms could backfire, sometimes with comic results, sometimes with consequences that lasted far beyond the laughter. Court records and ecclesiastical decrees mention ill-worked love philters and miscast knots, usually in tones suggesting both moral disapproval and a grudging fascination. One 15th century record from Cornwall tells of a man who ground rose petals and rosemary into a powder meant to make a woman soft of heart. Unfortunately, he spilled it into a communal stew pot at a feast. The result was an evening of bizarrely affectionate toasts among the elders and a fine for disturbing the order of the meal. Quirky case from Brittany. A girl embroidered her crush's name into a handkerchief using a thread dyed with beet juice, believing it would colour his dreams. She left it where he would find it, only for the dye to bleed in the rain and turn the name into something entirely unreadable. The village wag decided it looked like the word for goose, and the poor boy endured honking behind his back for weeks. Some historians think the risks were part of the appeal. A charm was a gamble if it worked. You gained love or loyalty. If it failed, at least you had a story. But not everyone laughed. A mistrusted charm could bring accusations of witchcraft, especially if livestock sickened or a harvest failed soon after. Parish priests warned that any unnatural binding trespassed on God's will, though their sermons didn't seem to reduce the sale of certain herbs in the marketplace. You picture the scene today. The young man swears the pouch only contains rosemary and a lock of hair from the woman's comb, but she insists it smells faintly of vinegar and curses. A neighbor leans in to sniff, pronounces it more likely soup than sorcery, and earns a round of chuckles. Light joke number 1. Someone offers to hang the pouch in the cowshed to encourage milking. Number 2. A passing shepherd claims it might work better on sheep. Number 3. The baker says he'll try it on his oven to keep the loaves from burning. The sensory details make it vivid. The faint, sweet, sharp smell of the herbs, the wet cobbles reflecting the light from the alehouse door, the sound of water dripping from the eaves. The crowd's laughter mixes with the cluck of hens wandering too close to the action. At the edge, a few people exchange glances that say they've tried such things themselves, or at least thought about it. Ethnographers note that love charms often functioned as a kind of semi-public declaration. Even if meant to be secret, the risk of discovery and the resulting talk could be part of the strategy. A charm found and discussed might push a courtship forward by giving it the village's attention, for better or worse. That dynamic made failure less final than it might seem. In a way, the charm succeeded if it got people speaking the couple's names in the same sentence. By the end of the exchange, the older woman has decided to return the pouch, though not without a warning to use it on yourself if you must. The young man pockets it with a shrug and a smile that suggests the morning will find him at the herb seller's stall again, asking for something stronger. As the crowd disperses, the lane smells briefly of rosemary and rain, a reminder that in the medieval village, love, like the weather, could change with a single small misstep. The last night before a wedding is a strange one. The day has been spent in errands, borrowing extra benches, fetching casks of ale from the brewer, making sure the borrowed cloak for the groom actually fits across his shoulders. Now the village has settled into a hush, broken only by the occasional bark of a dog or the creak of a cartwheel on its way home. In the bride's cottage, the air is warm with firelight and the smell of beeswax candles, but under the hum of preparations runs a quieter current. The knowledge that tomorrow will change more than anyone says aloud. In some places, this night was marked by a formal custom. In others, it passed like any other evening, save for the restless thoughts it carried. Accounts from the 14th and 15th centuries speak of keeping vigil in the bride's home, family and friends staying late, telling stories, offering advice that mixed sincerity with playful warnings. A sister might whisper about what it's like to share a bed through winter. An aunt might advise on stretching a stew to feed unexpected guests. A friend might smuggle in a sprig of rosemary to tuck under the pillow for luck in the first year. Folklore dressed the night in superstition. In parts of rural Germany, the bride was not to step outside after sunset, lest wandering spirits confuse her path.